Tom Watkins, who's chairman of our preservation committee. And Tom was going to do this back a few months ago, but the date that we picked to have him talk was the same date that the hurricane was due to arrive. So we thought either it's poor planning on our part, or was it really an insulting interference in our normal way of life. So in any event, it is what it is, and so we moved it to this date. And we're using this to kick off our second year of these lecture series that we started last year, and that makes sense. So without further ado, let me introduce Tom Watkins.
When I look out, I would like to welcome my fellow members of the board of the historical group, my neighbors, personal friends, and the other 5 of you that are showing up. John said we started this a couple years ago when he asked a group of us if we would come up with a topic that was pertinent to the history of the island and prepare it for a presentation. Well, this was in January of 2017, and fresh in everybody's mind was the after effects of Hurricane Matthew. And get to a minute what my interest was. But anyway, we thought that would be a good topic. We heard a lot about the hurricane of 1893. It was the last major hurricane to come through this area until Matthew did. So let's find out about it. So I said, okay, I'll do it. Now, one of the things when you undertake this is how do you qualify to speak about hurricanes? I gave this a practice speech to some friends of ours a month or so ago. And when it was over, the lady said it was nice, she appreciated it, but what qualified me to talk about hurricanes? Well, I'm an electrical engineer from Ohio. So obviously there's nothing in my education or career background that lets me become an expert to discuss hurricanes. However, there is an experience factor. So go to my first slide. There we go. We have had some experience with hurricanes. In September of 2008, Hurricane Ike rolled up out of the Gulf, came up the Mississippi Valley, then the Ohio Valley, and through southern Ohio. Okay, this was our farm at the time. This was our garden house at the farm, and this was a big old silver maple tree that went down during the storm. So that was our first experience with hurricanes. Now the next picture, you probably recognize because you've probably seen most of it, or seen it before. This was Matthew, October 2016, and that's our house on Dataw Drive. Now, you probably remember passing that. That was a pine tree that came down through the upstairs of the house. That one fell that direction. The other 2 that were right beside it fell across the street and had the road blocked for a while. So between this and this, I know a little bit about what a hurricane is. I'm not totally sure I am an expert on what causes a hurricane, but I do know what it's like. Now, we've all been through hurricanes a lot in the last 3 years. We've been here on the island 3 years, and we have had 3 hurricane alerts since we've been here. Matthew, Irma, and Florence was last year. Each one of them being Central Ohio Islands, Flatlanders, no experience with hurricanes. Each one of them we took off and head for the hills or Ohio. So we didn't experience any of them other than the build up to them. And like most of it, I assume all of you have. So as we talk about the hurricane of 1893, we've got to remember that's 125 years ago. And what I like to do as I go through this is kind of set the stage of what things were like 125 years ago. So you can contrast that a little bit with what you've all been through the last 3 years with all the television and the sheriff's notification and weather alerts and everything else that's kept you informed of what's going on. So let's set the stage a little bit for where we are. Back in 1893, the United States was only 44 states. We had a population of 63 million versus today's 325. The Civil War had only been over for 28 years. Long-distance transportation is by steam engine railroads and by steam engine ships. High-speed communication is by this high-tech electronic device, telegraph. Public information is basically disseminated through the newspapers. By 1891, the Weather Bureau, and that's capital letters, so there was a Weather Bureau, is responsible for providing flood warnings. But it isn't until 1898 when President McKinley establishes a hurricane warning system. So now here's where we are. There's really no way of really knowing anything quickly. Now let's take a peek a minute. This is what Beaufort looked like. I just found this old picture. It's about 1893. It's before the hurricane hit. But just to give you some idea of the difference between Beaufort then and now.
Is that the bank building in the middle?
I don't know.
And that was colors on it?
You can recognize some of them, I think. Okay, how about the Sea Islands? The Sea Islands are connected by rail to the mainland and by steamboat to the outside world. So we're not, the area is not completely isolated. Some of the islands, which I was kind of interested in seeing, are linked by ferries and by small bridges. The bridge, someplace along the line of my research, I found out the bridge causeway between Ladies Island and St. Helena Island probably dates back into the 1740s at least. I can find some record of that. Small boats are the prevailing mode of inter-island travel. The population of the county is 34,000. Today it's something over 180,000. And the rural portions of the islands, where we're living right now, are populated principally by African-American ex-slaves and their descendants. And they generally live, probably 100%, live on small subsistence farms. And there's a good means of transportation. On Dataw Island, no data really exists telling you much about what was on Dataw Island in the 1890s. But a reasonable assumption is there are 16 to 25 homes. Now, I say reasonable, what I did, I looked at the census for 18 and 80. The 1890 census, as you may know, is destroyed. It doesn't exist. But the 1880 census does identify the St. Helena Township, and it does identify Dataw Island. So you were able to look through that census and get some idea of the number of houses. So they're about 16 to 25. And when we say houses, remember, we're talking about what we would identify probably as cabins or sheds at the best. And maybe there's about 60 to 100 people live on the island. All the residents were black, and all the residents were farmers. Some of the cabins may have been near the old slave quarter area, which is, I understand, where our present maintenance area is, was the original slave quarter area. Others may have been on the 8-10-acre farm lots that were established after the Civil War on the north end of the island along the Morgan River. So we're not sure where they are, but they were probably in one of those two spots. The B.B. Sands house, the ruins that we're all familiar with, had been partially destroyed by fire in 1876, and it was apparently never reoccupied from that time, so nobody lived there, we're pretty sure. And then the Lewis Reeve Sam's house on the north portion of the island was probably abandoned and maybe even destroyed by hurricanes prior to the 1893 hurricane. But nevertheless, we don't think anyone was living there. The sea islands had historical experience with tropical storms. Obviously, hurricanes weren't a new thing in this neck of the woods. But no major hurricane had threatened the area for over 20 years. Now, this is kind of interesting. By 1893, the telegraph cable network, and I looked it up, and there were telegraph lines strung from the mainland to Nassau in the Bahamas. There were actually telegraph lines that went to Europe. So the telegraph cable network permitted tropical storms to be tracked as they passed over various landfalls, at least those landfalls that were occupied. Charleston gets the first word from Nassau, the Bahamas, on Friday, August 25th, saying that a violent storm is about 180 miles east of Florida. And then by Sunday morning on the 27th, pilot stations along the coast from Tybee Island to Fort Sumter have raised double gale warning flags. By Sunday afternoon, saw the leading edge of the storm was now visible from the barrier islands. Torrential rains and high winds begin to batter the coast. And at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the telegraph line to Charleston goes dead. So that gives you, that track was put together by the National Hurricane Warning System to replicate, or their best estimates of what the track of the 1893 storm looked like. So you can see it kind of right in behind us here in the Beaufort area. The residents of the city of Beaufort probably had warning that the residents of the city of Beaufort now probably had warning that a major storm was working its way up the coast because of the telegraph. However, concern mainly was focused on the equipment associated with the phosphate mining on St. Helena Sound and the ships that were anchored at Port Royal Naval Station. Although there is no report on specific actions being taken, I would have guessed that these folks knew what was coming. And since they had the experience, they probably took some steps to secure property. And we know, in fact, that some did evacuate. Now, again, we're talking about the folks that are from Beaufort. However, the farmers on the outlying sea islands probably had no warnings until the rain and wind began to build on Sunday afternoon and evening. And even though there's really no firsthand written reports from Dataw Island, there are some in files from St. Helena. And there's a couple of descriptions of people who experienced and lived through the storms. And they talk about just this. They say the winds built, the rains, and it kept getting worse and worse, and pretty soon the water starts coming up around their house. That's when they knew they were in trouble. The low tide that Sunday was at 2 p.m. And for the following 6 hours, they say the incoming tide came in with a force they had never before experienced. By high tide at 8 p.m., 21 bridges had been destroyed, as well as all the major ferries. The high tide was compounded by a storm surge that was at the time estimated to be 15 or 16 feet. The eye of the hurricane passed near the city of Beaufort around midnight. Reports at the time claimed that hurricane conditions existed for at least 15 hours. A few years ago, NOAA, National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, said that modeling of their slush, sea, lake, and overland surges from hurricanes program indicated that 30 feet of tidal water could have occurred. Dataw's highest point prior to the Alcoa development, here as I can tell, was about 22 feet above sea level. And it's located about at the present intersection of Island Circle East and Country Club Drive. Most of the island elevations are in the area of 10 to 15 feet. High tides in August can run 6 to 8 feet. A surge of 15 to 16 feet over high tide then would cover most of the island. And a tidal wave of 30 feet, everything would be underwater, which some people say that's the way it was here. There's a map, topographical map, showing, a little blue arrow shows where the high point is, around about 22 feet, about the intersection, again, Island Circle East and Country Club Drive. But the rest of it, I know down where we are on the south end, we're at about 13 feet. So the rest of it's 10 to 15 feet, all be underwater. So during the 1893 hurricane season, 10 hurricanes made landfall in the U.S. or its territories. I was kind of surprised because the news seems to be making a play that we're getting more hurricanes, or hurricanes are more frequent than they have been. But if you read back in that period of the 1800s, they were a pretty regular occurrence. The 1893 season was one of only 2 on record other than 1998, when 4 Atlantic hurricanes occurred, hit the U.S. at the same time, on the same day. They were in Puerto Rico, New York City, Nova Scotia, well, North America, Nova Scotia, and Savannah Sea Islands. So hurricanes weren't anything new. The 1893 Sea Islands hurricane made landfall at Savannah on August the 27th and passed over the Sea Islands on August the 28th. Figure wind speeds reached as much as 100 to 120 miles an hour. NOAA has estimated that the storm was at least a Cat 3 by today's measurement, and probably higher. The storm maintained hurricane forces for about 15 days of its life. So you can see that on that. It's around for a while. Okay, what happened? Immediate aftermath. I put 2 pictures on here to kind of show 2 aftermaths, if you will. The first one actually is, it was taken after the fact. This is in Beaufort. It's part of the library has a file of about 20-some pictures of damage. Most of them show shipwrecks and barges sunk, but there are a few that show building. This is kind of the main street, and you can see that it suffered a fair amount of damage. And then the other one you recognize is the oak tree at the Sam's Cemetery. I'll say something about that in a minute. Unfortunately, there are no first-hand written reports documenting the damage to Dataw Island. I looked through, I found several books, several articles referencing this hurricane, and virtually no. I have one mention that I'll tell you about of Dataw Island. So the reason why we don't have a lot of information about Dataw Island because there isn't any. And I think I got most of what there might be. The Beaufort County Library, as I said, has a collection on the storm that includes 20 photographs of the damage. These are of Beaufort City or ships and boats that were sunk or grounded. There are no pictures of the Sea Islands. The city photographs show considerable building and wharf damage along the waterfront. Witnesses at the time claimed the Sea Islands appeared as if a conflagration had swept the earth and destroyed and withered everything. Now, I read a couple of comments that said that might have been an overstatement of things. That's what somebody said. There were reports from other islands that the majority of houses in various locales were wrecked or washed away. As in our 216 Hurricane Matthew, live oaks were the major tree survivors. Many figured prominently in human survival stories since they provided perches for people to avoid the rising waters. I read several, again, accounts from people who survived the storms as kids. And they say they remember their father taking them out and putting them up in the tree and tying them in the tree. And another one said they remembered their father coming out and getting a log chain and putting it around the cabin in a tree, hopefully keep the tree from blowing away. Here on Dataw, we still have some evidence of what was and was not washed away. The live oak in the Salmon Cemetery obviously survived, as did the two oaks that frame the Gulf path between Gleason's Landing and Longfield roads. The B.B. Sands house ruins survived, but I don't know whether we can really say how much further damage was done by the hurricane. The Sam Cemetery was not washed away, but oral tradition says that part of the old slave cemetery on Cotton Dyke Road was, and I think Joe mentioned that earlier today. Oral traditions also says that the Lewis Reed Sam's house at the north end of the island was washed away by the rising waters on the Morgan River. There's some thought today that perhaps it had been destroyed or wrecked at least by some previous hurricanes, and the 1893 was not the death knell was not the one that really flattened it out. It had been previous damage. Although the storm did long-term damage to the economy of the area, phosphate, cotton, and rice production were essentially brought to an end. The major impact of the hurricane was on human life. Estimates of deaths, and they're all over the place, but they range between 1,000 and 3,000, which would place it as either the fourth or fifth largest killer storm in U.S. history. The Beaufort County coroner deputized a number of individuals to gather information on the dead. And that was pretty quick after the hurricane. He sent folks out to the islands to see if he could get an accurate count on what fatalities. In the first week after the storm, the preliminary count had already reached 752. Almost all victims had drowned. And as such, many bodies were probably never recovered. The deaths almost all occurred, or almost all, in the rural black population on the Sea Islands. What records there are claim that only 3 deaths occurred in the towns, that would be Port Royal and Beaufort, and each of those was to a white person. One of the observations common to most of the articles that I read describing the devastation is the large number of domestic animals that were drowned. Recognize these folks were all farmers, so they kept animals for subsistence as well as labor. So you can imagine dogs, horses, cows, pigs, chickens, everything wiped out. Now, in the coroner's report, the Dataw area is listed with 37 deaths. This is the only item I could find in the all the stuff I looked up that makes a mention of Dataw Island in the storm. But there are no published stories dealing with the deaths of these victims, as exist for some of the other Sea Islands. There are stories from people from St. Helena and Ladies Island, some stories of survivors and who people that were killed. Weeks after the storm moved on, as you can imagine, the bodies continued to be recovered. Burials were generally done quickly. As you can imagine, it's August, and there's a lot of bodies around, human and animals, without ceremony, due to concerns over the sanitation and disease. They also were usually done at the spots where the bodies were recovered, and often in common and unmarked graves. Now, during the building of the current Dataw Island community by Alcoa, 4 graves were discovered and identified, at least, in the Cashera Point area. Some speculation is that at least a couple of these may be the result of the hurricanes, but you can't tell for sure. Using our estimates that we had of the Dataw population of 60 to 100 at the time, it would appear then, if we use these figures as a kind of a guide, 40 to 60% of the island residents were killed. That's a lot of folks. Now let's move on to the recovery. And for the recovery, I've used 3 pictures here of 3 individuals that are identified with the recovery. And you maybe can't see all of them. The first one you probably recognize is Robert Smalls from Beaufort. The second one is Ben Tillman, who was the governor at the time. His nickname was Pitchfork, for reasons I think probably most of us know. And over at the far side is Claire Barton, who was head of the American Red Cross. All of them figured somewhat in the recovery. Okay, the first response, again, now it's much different than it is today. After we've seen the response in the federal government. In 1893, there were no standing governmental agencies to deal with natural disasters. Or its aftermaths. On Monday, August the 30th, assessments of the damage began, and it was overwhelming on the Sea Island. So they put people out to see what had happened. There was a massive kill-off of farm animals, the destruction of over 50 to 75% of the homes. Here's another thing to remember. These folks were all subsistence farmers. There were ruinations of crops that were in the field, sweet potatoes, corn, and cotton. That was their livelihood. They're gone. Something I hadn't thought about, but would have been a major issue, was the contamination of wells. Drinking water's gone. And flooded fields everywhere. The whole place is flooded. Water didn't all go away. Coupled with this was the lack of communication and transportation. Boats, the primary source of communication between the islands, had obviously been destroyed or washed away. Even so, it appears that community leaders in Beaufort reacted quickly to address the issues they encountered. Besides making plans for their own damaged buildings, they formed the Sea Island Relief Committee to seek outside assistance and to organize reconstruction. And this included the mayor as well as the well-known Robert Smalls. So he was part of the recovery area right at the very outset. How about government? What did government do? As we previously mentioned, there was no established role for government at the state or national level. The governor of California was notified by telegraph on the night of August 31st. He immediately dispatched a doctor to the area to assess the situation. Based on what he learned, he issued a call for all classes of people to make contributions of food, clothing, money, and other necessities of life. However, other than continue to make public appeals for assistance, that's about all he did. There was no immediate aid provided by the state, and when the legislature was appealed to later in the year, they went into their December adjournment without taking action. No help whatsoever. There was similarly no immediate assistance given by the federal government. The thought was, or the rationale behind not giving any aid to the area, was that if the federal government stepped in here, it would have to likewise do something for the other areas of the country, which at the time were suffering from a widespread national depression. We don't want to start anything because we have to do it for everybody. I read and I found out that sometime down the road, the Secretary of War did provide some tents for temporary housing, but claimed that he did not have the authority to provide rations for civilians. And finally, the Navy did supply some ships and boats for the relief effort. And then finally, the following spring, the Department of Agriculture sent some seed down for crops. So there was some minimal relief, but nothing to address what the real problem was. So what happened? Well, by the third week of the storm, even the full magnitude had taken shape. Plus, there was a growing awareness that the storm had also had a devastating effect on the farming areas in the northern part of Beaufort County. I mean, they were flooded, had the water and the wind, so even though they maybe didn't have the physical destruction that they had on the islands, they did have crop damage, serious crop damage. At this time then, Governor Tillman made an appeal to the American Red Cross to provide assistance. Now this I didn't really know this, but the American Red Cross had been established by Claire Barton, I think we all knew that, in May of 1881, and had already become known for its response to the Great Michigan Thumb Fire of 1881, and then the Johnstown Flood of 1889. So it was a body that was in place and was already functioning. Interestingly, Claire Barton was familiar with the Sea Islands, and I didn't know this either, and their people. She had spent 9 months working in a hospital on Hilton Head during the Civil War, so she kind of knew the territory. The Red Cross personnel were dispatched to Beaufort in late September, and Miss Barton, age 72 at the time, was designated by the governor to take charge of the relief operation in early October. For the next 8 months, the American Red Cross and Miss Barton coordinated the provision of food and other supplies to over 40,000 people. The American Red Cross representatives oversaw a program whereby Native workers dug over 37 miles of drainage ditches that permitted farming activity to begin in the spring of 1895. They had to drain them, and there's a lot of stories, I forget how many miles they said they dug, but there were a lot of drains dug. They coordinated the building of docks, the Red Cross, established medical services, and provided the materials for the Sea Islanders to rebuild their homes. All this was carried out by the receipt of aids from the private citizenry. And to Miss Barton's dismay, there was little or no governmental help. I read that private donations, mainly from churches, a lot of churches in the north, totaled to $30,000 was how much she received for this 8-month activity of hurricane recovery. Media attention. Once the telegraph lines were reestablished at Charleston and then on to New York, the press responded by spreading the news on the conditions left by the storm, as well as the governor's and others' appeals for relief. So the news finally did get out. But there is some thought that early storm coverage was rather low-key and not given front page status, since those principally impacted were the black ex-slaves of the Low Country. So a little bit more about that. It's interesting, as I went through and read some of this, how often race became an issue in these reconstruction or these relief activities. The fact that the major impact of the storm was on the black population of the Low Country was offered as a reason why the early newspapers reporting tended to understate the severity of the storm or bury the story altogether. The fact that the governor, Ben Tillman, was a Democrat, a racist, and not sympathetic to the Sea Islanders, who were basically Republicans, may explain his failure to get too involved in relief activities. One of the things I read that when questioned about how were these people going to eat, the governor evidently said, "What? They live on the ocean, they can fish. They'll have access to fishing." Well, yeah, every boat in the area was washed away or damaged by the hurricane. So that was a measure of his lack of care or awareness of what was going on. The partisan political attitude was also apparent at the state and national legislative bodies, who used the excuse that the ongoing national depression left no funds available for this type of spending. It is also interesting to note that how many of those providing relief, including the Red Cross, left written records warning against granting too much charity, since it would encourage laziness and dependency. Relief should only be given to those who are willing to work to improve their conditions. And Claire Barton herself wrote orders saying, hey, if they don't work, they don't eat. As the cleanup went on, interesting enough, I found this out too. Complaints from the white upland farmers, and remember the relief's going on clear through June of the following year. They felt that the relief efforts were being focused on the Black Sea Islanders, whereas they were experiencing the same loss of food due to crop storage. So now you had a reverse racial thing going on. Okay, the storm ended a period of economic prosperity for Beaufort County that had been on the rise since the end of the Civil War. What followed was 30 years of decline. The immediate impact was the decline and the ultimate loss of the phosphate industry. At the time of the storm, the industry provided 3,000 jobs for the county, 3,000 jobs. The storm wrecked most of the facilities and equipment associated with the mining operation, which was really a dredge type operation that occurred out in the rivers and sound. Although a few mines rebuilt, competition from other areas of the country signaled the demise of the local industry by the early 1900s. And I guess they discovered phosphates down around Tampa, Florida, that were easier to get to. So that's what kind of blew away the industry here. The importance of the Port Royal Navy Yard continued throughout the 1890s and the Spanish-American War. However, the storm raised concern about the overall suitability of Port Royal Sound for the expanding U.S. Navy. A major change of direction occurred when ex-Governor Tillman became a U.S. Senator. It was felt his longtime hostility to the Low Country and its residents became a factor as he worked closely with the Charleston community to expand Navy operations and facilities there. And the interesting thing I read about there, Port Royal was a deep water port, and they had dry dock there that was big enough to accommodate the largest battleship the U.S. had. So it was a deep water port. I think Charleston Harbor was about 26 feet deep, and before they could turn it into a major deep water port, they had to undertake major dredging operations to clear it. So, as far as the Low Country black community was concerned, they appear to have reverted to their small farming activity. The 1900 census of Dataw and St. Helena Township records many of the pre-storm families, with virtually every household being that of the farmer. And I was able to pick out some of the same names of folks that were here in 1880 were here in this area in 1900. Okay, in summary, the hurricane then that hit the Sea Islands on August 27, 1893, still ranks as number 4 or 5 in all-time deadliness to hit the USA mainland, since it's resulted in perhaps close to 3,000 deaths. The storm was a Class 3 by today's standards, with winds approaching 120 miles an hour and pushing as much as a 30-foot tidal surge. The population that felt the wrath of the storm was the black farmers on the remote islands. Over 70% of their homes were destroyed. Their respective state and federal governments played a very minor role in relief efforts, with the main effort carried forth by the following summer under the direction of the American Red Cross. And finally, the destruction of life and property resulted in an economic setback to the area that didn't alleviate for at least 50 years. And that is it. I found about 4 books, and they're all available in the library. I checked the other day, they're in the library. Actually, where did I look? I looked at the one over here on St. Helena. And they give a pretty good story of describing the one's called The Great Sea Island Storm of 1893. And it gives a pretty good story of the overall area and the storm. And then I found the library has there was a number of articles that showed up in the time, at the time. One of them, interesting enough, was a magazine article by Joel Chandler Harris. And I think he was the fellow that wrote the Uncle Remus stories. And he wrote, he was sent down by Scribner's Magazine in 1894 to write an article of the storms. I read the article, and it kind of talks a little bit about the storm, but then it kind of drifts off into other subjects. So there's the story of the hurricane. Now I'm glad we finally got to tell it.